Alrighty, so we've decided to take a bit of a left turn for the panel. Most panel discussions are, we know what these people do, let's ask them questions about exactly what they do. We've decided to have a little more fun while the judges head out and make their deliberations, and focus on maybe some of the issues in sport and tech that are sort of small c controversial, issues that are starting to raise their head. If you have to be living in a hole somewhere to understand now that companies like Facebook and others that have felt themselves a bit above any scrutiny are now coming under pretty intense scrutiny. And I think we're seeing the same across sort of digital and sport landscape. But before I jump into that, I can't help but start it off a little differently. Usually I'm screaming at panels for the lack of women on a panel. I think this is the first panel, I've ever had that's all women, which is terrific. But let me ask a question on the other side. I think, by observation, we've seen a terrific rise in women's sport, and certainly Australia is, right in the front of that in terms of at least the visible movement there. Lots of movement in terms of executive board positions in sport and out of sport. But when you look under the covers, it seems to me that progress is still pretty slow. And I guess, what I'd ask of you, if you have a perspective on this, is I think we know some of the things maybe we're starting to get right, but what are we getting wrong? What is it that we're missing on? What are the things that we're not focusing on that need to be?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think today was a great example. We had no women pitching, right? We had a whole accelerator and there was not one woman, co-founder, executive. Every slide on that thing was a man. And this leads to the problem that we have in our society. We've put some women out front, but what do we have then? We can't pay them equality because, there's not enough money in the TV rights. Okay, who controls the TV rights? Is Deb still here? Foxtel? No disrespect to Foxtel. They're run by a bunch of old white men. And old white men assume only old white men will want to watch the television, so they don't engage. So generally there's a systemic problem in the whole value chain about how we value sport and what we believe people will want. The irony of that is 75% of the consumer purchasing decisions in this world are made by women. So women are actually the people buying the soap powder, the car, the house, the internal stuff that these guys are trying to sell, even the beer we're buying. So it's ironic that the world has not pivoted. I'm kind of patient, but we need to make that systemic change. And it starts with, having, just making equality a standard. Even on the judging panel today, we had 2 women, we had 4 men. Could we not have found a woman to make that equal? I think we have to stand our ground and we just have to say what is acceptable. I think we need more women in the boards, rooms of the TV executives that say, I don't agree that we won't find a women's audience. Netball went all around the dial and now it's got a proper commercial partner and bingo, it's getting viewers. It's bringing brands along with it. Suncorp stood out and now it's got a good brand. So I think this is systemic change. I appreciate things take a while, but I'm impatient.
Sarah, Jane, Janet?
Oh, look, I totally endorse what Monica has just said. And there's so much we could discuss on this. But something I would add, I think just recently, and it has been very recently, with the US women's soccer team winning the FIFA World Cup the other day, just a fantastic result. But more than their performance on the field, I would say, that moment to me represents an absolutely groundbreaking moment, not just in women's sport, but for also gender equality, empowerment of women. And the reason is that Alex Morgan, the captain of that team, and the team has challenged for the first time in the world, equal pay in the federal court in the US. That case is being heard later this year, and the result I think we're all watching, because if they win, and they will get a lot of traction for their case out of the World Cup win the other day, in addition to their ratings, which I might add are exceeding those ratings of the men's US soccer team. Their audiences, live audiences in stadium are exceeding those of the men's US soccer team. Their valuation as well, their social media followings. Alex Morgan is the most followed female athlete in the world now. Millions and millions and millions of followers. So, it goes on. But with those statistics and the win, I think they might even win this case for equal pay, which means that every female sporting team in the world can now look to that sort of a challenge ahead, and it will be really interesting to see the domino effect from that. So I think it's very exciting times in women's sport. The second point I would make is that it is a different product to men's sport. I think it's a better product in many, many ways. One of the reasons being it represents a serious platform for social change. I know all sport is that. It's one of the reasons I'm involved in sport, in research and administration, but it is absolutely a very empowering platform for women. And it, you know, that old message we hear all the time, you can't be what you cannot see. But to see women displaying strength, leadership, resilience, incredible commitment and demonstrating high performance on a sporting field translates in message to the business world, to the not-for-profit world, to women and young men as well, looking up to these female athletes as aspirational. So lots to be said on this. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll add something there. Thank you. To Monica's point earlier that there were no female founders pitching today, I think that's an interesting point that you make too, that the sports leagues are all run by predominantly men. And so is the investment markets, predominantly run by men. So when you have females up there that are founding businesses and pitching against not often many women, if at all, I just wonder if there is a skew towards a male-founded company and funding that company over a female-funded company. I don't have any statistics. I'm not an expert in that. Thank you. Less than 4% apparently. But I think that that's something that we do need to get better at. And there are organisations that are focused on accelerating women-founded businesses, which I think is brilliant, as there are organisations that are focused on getting women on boards, which is also brilliant. So I think that the shift will come slowly. I'm sorry, Monica, it's not going to be as fast. But you'll make it fast. I'll try. I will. And I've got 3 daughters, and when I started out this journey, they said, "No, Mum, you have to do it." And it happened to be at the time when Nike launched their "Crazy If You Don't" campaign. And my eldest turned around and said, "Mum, you're crazy if you don't." And that was empowering for me as a mum to say, right, my daughter's always been a marketer's dream. She knew the Mercedes logo on a car from a mile away. But it was really empowering as a mum to say, okay, well, if I've got the backing of my kids here, they're the next generation. They need to see what can happen. And I'm really happy that I'm able to show them.
Terrific. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on that. So let's get back to the topic.
Oh, did you? Can I just add?
Yeah.
Women do run sport, right? We just run the invisible part that actually sport could not function without. We wash the jerseys, we bring the oranges, and we run the tuck shop.
And to a large degree decide what sport your kids play. All right, so let's go back to, or directly on sport and tech. So many questions we could talk about here. Let's start with, I suppose, a highly topical one, which is sort of social media platforms and athletes. You know, maybe the 2 most recent examples, certainly Israel Folau is an example recently. I would argue Megan Rapinoe from the U.S. women's soccer team, you know, her sort of feud with Donald Trump. In most of the other entertainment industries, and if we can call sport for a minute, at least in this context, an entertainment industry, there's a lot of freedom given to musicians, to actors, to sort of say what they feel and feel what they say. They may lose a little bit of a market one way or the other, but there's that freedom given. It seems that, at least certainly in the current climate, that athletes need to now be brand aligned as opposed to necessarily be individual voices. Just interested in your sort of comments around that entire space. There's lots of things we could talk about in there, but when you think about this notion of the club has always been the platform, or the traditional media has been the platform, but now that the athletes themselves essentially can be their own platform, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Where are the limits? What are your views of current cases?
Where do you start? Yeah, look, I'd probably make a few points, and I'll be really punchy on this. I think, firstly, we're seeing with the rise of social media, that all brands are using it, we're seeing the ability, with that low barrier of entry, the rise of the human brand. And so we're seeing the rise of the celebrity sports brand, the rock stars. They've all got that ability to use it as a platform for direct communication to their fans and consumers. This can be a great thing. I think with the women's sport example, we saw in Australia recently the Taylor Harris example, where she was able to come back directly to the mass population, and around the world it actually went viral, in terms of challenging the trolls online. So it was used as a very positive platform there, hopefully for social change. On the other hand, we have Israel Folau, we have other sports stars potentially behaving badly. They are, of course, under legal contracts and morality clauses and all the rest. But aside from that, to your point, Scott, I suppose in some jurisdictions like the US, there's freedom of speech as a right. In others, such as Australia and many other democracies, it's not a legal right. And in fact, they're very restricted by various legislation against that sort of stuff. But I suppose what happens is, for all brands on social media, is the effect is their messages are greatly augmented in a very, very small amount of time. And this can be a huge risk for sponsors of sports, for instance. And as a result of this, and these athletes potentially behaving badly online, the sponsor brands have enormous power over the sports and the celebrity athletes. And in many cases, they're very, very involved, if not making the decision, dare I say, in the background around what will happen to that particular celebrity athlete when they post negative tweets that do not align with the sponsor brand, let alone the sports brand.
Thank you. So I'm not really an expert in contractual law or employment law or anything, but I think to the question of entertainment personalities versus sports personalities, my understanding is that the key difference there is that there is some contractual obligations for the behaviour on social media that should be upheld, because we are teaching generations upon generations. So, as you know, Sarah said, the word gets out there so rapidly, and it can affect, and in many cases, the conversation can happen in a split second, and then all of the fallout thereafter gets missed. So it's just that key point that gets seen, observed and acted upon or opinionated upon. So I do think that that there is the need for people to observe their contractual obligations. I think that there is a duty of care for the way they behave on social media based on that. And that's mine.
I think that in terms of the Israel Folau comment, well, actually generally, it's not so much it is what he said, but he chose to take divisive, judgmental language. And I think over time, that's his right to do that, absolutely. But it's also our right to switch off him. And if we switch off him, and I switch off any brand that supports him, that's where the implication comes in. So if he can find enough far right-wing people that like to judge everyone in the world and tell people you're either this or you're that, and if you're only this tiny little group over here, we all love each other and we'll support you, $2 million flowed into him the next day. So that there's $2 million worth of people in Australia that supported either his edict or what he had to say. And I absolutely respect his right of free speech to take that money and do what he wanted with. I would prefer, and I gravitate my spending and my money and my support of sporting teams or corporations that choose to unite us and not divide us with the messages they say. He could have easily sent a blessing to everyone in the world. He could have easily taken a very positive piece out of the Bible that was a message to all mankind to be better, to be kinder, to be more generous, but he chose not to. So for me, there was a very deliberate choice to use divisive language that was very judgmental, and that was probably the problem, less about what he was standing for.
Fair enough. Great comments. And by the way, if any of the audience feels compelled to say something on the topic, I'll give a little glance back after each one. Feel free to stick your hand up. One of the presentations near the end talked about athlete data, and at a very conceptual level, I think it's pretty easy to buy into the notion that we should all own our data. But I guess my question is, and maybe particularly with the upper ranks, the professional ranks, isn't that a little naive when you think about what the stake the clubs have in it, the coaches have in it, other athletes, gambling, I mean, you name it, right? Sort of all the way down the list. do you have any particular thoughts about where data should go, who should own data, and who shouldn't?
I'll start this one. I think it's who should own the data, I think, is a really interesting question. I also think having the lens over the analysis of that data, particularly at a professional level, I get the importance of analysing a player's data and their performance and how that can influence the games that follow or their selection to different teams and so on. I think that the overlay of any personal experience that might impact, for example, if there's a death in the family or something like that, that can't be captured by the data. So I think that the players do need to have a voice within the data and the analysis of the data, whether they own it or not. I don't know. I guess that comes down to their arrangements with their teams and the leagues. But I think that they all need to have access to it. But I do think that they need to be able to take that human element across the data as well as they're doing the analysis.
I do know in Australia, largely, by and large, this is speaking very generally, the sports own the data, the athlete data. It's contracted away from the athlete, basically, which is interesting because in the US, in Europe, a lot of this data is often shared. The ownership is shared, so the athlete retains some personal rights to the data. And I think this might evolve in Australia a little bit because I think as the athletes perhaps become aware and the players' associations become aware of this fact, there's a very real chance that they might be able to negotiate that perhaps if the data is being used for commercial purposes by the sports, which one would argue increasingly, especially with what we've seen today with those fantastic pictures and our earlier speakers as well, the sorts of trends that Travis pointed out and Fox Sports pointed out as well, that this sort of data is very, very valuable for commercialisation for all sorts of purposes. So I think if you could make that argument that the athlete in fact might have a legal right to a share of it should it be used for those purposes. If it's used for to aggregate, to enhance high performance or ensure injury prevention, then I think it's probably fair enough the sports can own that in order to leverage the benefit of the the syndication of that data.
Well, I don't own my data, and I know I'm a little bit off being a professional athlete. But Google, Facebook, the FANGs own my data. I'm waiting for the people that rule our countries, our elected officials, to go to The Hague and start to make a data convention that pays back to every citizen of the world a dividend that we can reinvest in automation, our nations, based on the fact they're making billions of dollars out of our data. So I guess that's where I come from, and I think, okay, so sportsmen are a subset of that data cloud that people are. So there should be an absolute right that if the data is commercialised, that there should be a data dividend. I think in the future we're going to get much better at this, and almost in a cooperative model or a model of usefulness, there should be a dividend that can be paid back.
Fair enough, thank you. Any thoughts on that? No? Moving on, okay. I'm pretty much an eternal optimist when it comes to technology, but there's a couple of things that have me a little concerned. And probably the biggest one is, so Wesfarmers is the largest employer, or at least used to be until they divested, but let's consider them still Wesfarmers. Used to be the biggest employer, was the biggest employer in Australia. About 75% of their workforce are either checkout people or transportation people, arguably two professions that in, pick a number, 15 years, 20 years, maybe 10, are gone. And when I think about that in the sport context, a couple of things come to mind, but just maybe the more fun one to come to mind initially. You look right now, you've got a lot of technology helping referees and umpires, video replays, Hawkeye, that sort of stuff. Should the goal be to, as quickly as we can, replace them? Is that a good replacement strategy, or is that just that's a folly?
I'm an absolute fan for whoever can do the job better, and if technology can do the job and keep the game flowing in a way that is good and everything's fair, I think we should use it. And I'm a big fan also of looking beyond this, I kind of get a little bored with the conversation that says the technology is going to take my job, right? The technology we've been dealing with is time immemorial, and each time we've evolved, more jobs have been created. And I would love to see humans putting their humanness back into the world rather than their roboticness back into the world. So I think I'm interested in a whole new future of work where maybe even citizens are paid a couple of days or a couple of hours a day to exercise, because if I was paid for a couple of hours a day to exercise, maybe we'd have a lower health bill, and maybe I'd have a higher productivity bill. So I see, my kind of structure of where I come from.
Endorsement for PUML as the winner for the competition, is that?
Well, I think I would endorse all of them. I think that I would use my ski gear with Quipco. So for me, it's more an issue of I don't buy by that paradigm that it's one for one. I think there is space always for creativity and the humanness of the game. So I never want technology to get in the way of those two, the human spirit and bringing that to the forefront. But I definitely think technology can enable that to happen better and faster and richer, and the fan engagement tools and the things that we're doing here create really positive personal human chemistry. And that's the beauty of sport. It's a wonderful chemistry changer. And that chemistry makes us feel better, it makes us feel more united, and we go away from that stepping a little higher, probably being a little sicker, maybe thinking we could possibly be a little better physically. So for me, I would rather take that angle than it's going to take over my job.
Any other comments from the panel?
Oh, look, I'd endorse that as well. And, I sort of think, what would we yell at? I mean, what would we wouldn't be able to throw anything at the TV if the refs and the algorithms are 100%, which they are, although there have been some real issues in the testing of that. But I know as the learning evolves, the AI learning, it will be 100% accurate. They're now seeing it with medical diagnosis, for instance, so they're going to see it with sports umpiring and refereeing as well. I think a side point is, as I mentioned before about, I suggested, the role modelling angle of sport. It's been wonderful to see some female referees appearing steadily as part of that movement around the rise of women's sports. It includes people able to significantly affect the game, which are referees and umpires. So I think it'd be really sad to see referees and human umpires disappear. I see them playing probably a collaborative role with the AI, just to keep that visual role modelling around for the fans, for the players in how they interact and react to adverse decisions. I just think it brings a lot to the fan engagement of the game as well.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's right, and I agree with both of those things. I think that part of the thing with watching a game and a live referee is that human error element that can augment that fan experience, and it does drive the passion. I think there's a few ground level games where there's probably a better need to have a electronic umpire as opposed to some of the umpires. When you look at some of the passion of parents, if you like, on the sideline, it might be better if the umpires were protected. But I agree. I think that augmenting it and using it for creativity. Yeah.
I did want to share a really cool story. I am a rugby mum, tragic, often a rugby auntie now. And I remember watching, there was a guy called Paul Lucas who was a minister in the Labor Party here some years ago in Queensland. And he, in one of his, I think he's a UQ professor also in one of your faculties, adjunct. But I watched him referee an under-8s rugby union game, and I have to tell you, there was not a dry eye on the sidelines of this fiercely contested game between Souths and Easts that are usually they're two sets of parents that are very kind of big rivals in Queensland. And we had tears in our eyes because every play he knelt down next to the player and coached what they'd done wrong and why he intervened. And he did that for 45 minutes, and these little under-8s, everyone came off the field feeling like they'd won, and for once the referee got a standing ovation from the parents.
Yeah. Well, look, maybe that goes to what you were saying in the first place, which is if you let the technology take care of a lot of the technical stuff, then the referees and officials can focus on the more human stuff. Fair enough. Do we have time? I don't know, do we have time for one more question? One more question? Okay. It'll have to be relatively quick, I think. Trying to choose from, I got a litany of questions here, but look, we're in Australia, so I'm going to choose this one. So online has taken betting to a whole new level. right? In fact, to such a level that it's now legal in the US, which, as someone coming from North America, I never thought, right, that would happen. Betting also now argues that it's the police, that the gambling houses are the ones that are actually watching where matches are getting fixed, and without them, there wouldn't be the kind of watchdog there needs to be. But obviously, gambling also has many, many dark sides to it. So I guess just generally, in the #1 betting country in the world per capita, where do you see sort of the line? What are the lines we shouldn't cross when it comes to betting? What comes to mind?
Well, I grew up where we used to buy, my grandmother always sent me something called a casket ticket, which I think was a precursor to lottery, what was a physical thing. And she used to send them because they paid for our hospitals. So I'm pretty much against gambling, period. But I really think there's a social dividend that has to be paid back if they're. So I would tax them dramatically, gambling, if not remove it from the game altogether, or make it using technology, something that's not a win-loss for money, it's actually a win-loss for. So that's what I like about some of the sports tables and the fantasy sports, where people are still able to have the engagement, but it's not about, gambling away my life.
Yeah, look, it's obviously a very controversial subject in sport, not only in this country but globally. It's the #1 problem around sporting integrity and corruption right now. It's match fixing related to the gambling, absolutely related and growing. In jurisdictions where it's illegal, like India, we have more than $1 trillion betting market in the black market. In the US, it's now a windfall. The integrity tax that the NBA is getting, I think at 1%, will be quite a few $1 billion to the NBA for their integrity tax. But with that, as all the sports do and invest in and partnering with Sports Radar, with all the betting companies, and I've got personal experience working with them, they have huge integrity areas now. They've doubled, tripled down their staffing in that area because they are now the police. They're using AI and algorithms to actually find out. It's very interesting to have a look at it, where they can pick up those anomalies very, very quickly in real time and feed it straight to the Interpol if it comes in, or the Australian Federal Police. And the sporting clubs all have integrity subcommittees involved as well. So it's reported very, very quickly when there is an anomaly between the average betting market and the real-time betting market. So it is quite easy to catch it. That being said, the incentives that exist in sport, so I suppose we know the demand side's there and we can't affect it much at all. But on the supply side of match fixing and betting, it's the people who can affect the game and how they're incentivised. And unfortunately, the referees, the umps, a lot of the grassroots and second-tier players, we've seen it here in Australia in tennis in particular, are very, very vulnerable because they don't earn the salaries. They don't have a lot to lose by engaging in this sort of match fixing. So it's a very real problem and very, very difficult to address. But the technology has been the solution by and large.
Terrific. So are you're back? Yeah, they're back? All right, well, look, please join me in thanking the panel. It was a very fun discussion. Thank you very much, ladies.